this organization, which is then soon incorporated, and it deals with all sorts of issues, more or less political. She's involved with famine relief in the Ukraine. Her organization is very big in helping Greek refugees after the Turkish-Greek population exchanges after 1923. And again, so there's an organization which engages sometimes politically as in the anti-boycott, sometimes just in a humanitarian fashion as in the move of refugees, and lives in this realm in between, and still exists, right? I mean, the Save the Children is still a major organization, and these kinds of organizations then exist all over the world. So there's a very important number of Latin American women's organizations which get very involved in these kinds of issues. In fact, it's a Latin American women's organization that first puts women's rights onto the international political agenda. So it's a conference in Montevideo on the nationality of married women, whose nationality often followed that of their husbands rather than that of their own, which was one of the first sorts of intergovernmental conventions and statements which argued for that men and women should exist equally in the spectrum of national belonging. So, in the interwar period, then there's an accretion of these organizations, both with political interests like the women's issue, and with relief and humanitarian interests, and in the space in between. In the late 1930s, for reasons that you guess, the number of these organizations goes down. The founding of these organizations goes down, but they still exist. So we had, before the beginning of the Second World War, a pretty robust infrastructure of organizations and protocols. Workers, women, issues of racial equality, and others that we've international friendship that we talk about. So let's go to now in 1948 to 1966. Well, the important thing, of course, happens in 48 is the putting in place of this infrastructure of norms with the universal Declaration. Now, it did not create a sudden outburst of new human rights organizations in the 1950s and early 1960s. The word human rights was very little used, but these organizations I'm telling you about continued to exist. And then, starting in the early 1960s and accelerating, there's a new burst of activity in the creation of this civil society, and I think some of which has its origins slightly earlier. Oxfam would be the humanitarian version of this organization, which began as a fund to save the children, famine relief. Famine relief during the war, 1942 and then 1944, but becomes a more general organization after the war, and that again develops first a national infrastructure, people engaged in humanitarian relief. So every English town has a shop that sells secondhand goods for Oxfam. I mean, like a rescue, what do you call it? What's it called? Where you go buy used clothes. Goodwill, that's Goodwill. There's a generic word for it, isn't it? Thrift shop? Sorry? Thrift, they call them thrift shops. You know what I mean. Every shop has it. It's like the Goodwill, only even bigger. Then they have this international arena in 1983, and now they're one of the world's biggest and most competent relief organizations, which for a long time wasn't engaged in politics, but which learned to its pain in dealing with Somalia in particular that it could not do that, and is now both a very competent relief organization and an organization which understands it needs to be engaged both in local and international politics and the politics of human rights. So there's Oxfam and the humanitarian version, and then there's Amnesty International. I want to just pause for a moment and tell you something about Amnesty International, because it's sort of, I think, sort of fascinatingly political and not political. So amnesty, let me tell you about amnesty, and then I'll go on. Let me tell you about amnesty. So amnesty is founded in 1961. It's one of these, like all these sort of founding myth stories. It is true that it was begun by a British journalist named Peter Benenson, Benenson. And it's true that he writes an article for an important British newspaper, called The Observer, and he writes an article called Forgotten Prisoners. He claimed that he wrote the article because he read about the capture and torture of two young students by the Portuguese dictatorship. And people investigating this origin myth have never been able to find this article. So whether this is a true story or not a true story, I don't know. But it isn't true that he wrote this article. And the article aroused a certain amount of activity and interest. You saw in Labor how she gets interested in this, and we'll get to this in a moment. And the point of that was to enforce the norms of the Universal Declaration, particularly norms 18 and 19, which allowed for freedom of the press and freedom of political expression. He, Benenson, works with and develops this organization with a friend, a man named Eric Baker, who is a member of the Religious Society of Friends. So our old buddies, the Quakers, whom we remember from anti-slavery and other days, come back into this story in modern international human rights civil society. So in 1961, they found an organization whose aim was to call for the enforcement and respect for Articles 18 and 19 of the Universal Declaration. Now, they're sort of interestingly not political. So in the early days of amnesty, they had everybody who became an amnesty letter writer. You guys know how amnesty works? They ask every member to write some letters to governments about prisoners of conscience. I don't think they do this now, but in the old days, everyone had to sign up to write 3 letters. One to a prisoner of conscience in a communist country, one to a prisoner of conscience in a non-communist country, and one for a prisoner of conscience in the developing world. So they were going to be absolutely sure that they represented equal opportunity oppression, so to speak. They were also very leery about direct political involvement. So one of the big, almost institution-splitting quarrels in Amnesty International earlier on was whether they were going to take on the case of Nelson Mandela, which they didn't. They didn't because the African National Congress advocated violence, and Amnesty International was committed to nonviolence. Well, Sam Moyn would argue this is a sign of their utopianism. I think it's a sign that these were they don't do this first thing anymore, and it's a sign of this organization. You have political debates. Every organization has political debates. And whether they were effective or not effective in any individual country is a matter of study. And we know in some places they weren't effective. In fact, they were dangerous. And we know, I think, that in many other they were. And I think on balance, they were effective. In any case, Amnesty then gets consultative status at the UN, becomes sort of a major player and also various regional organizations, the Western Hemisphere the Organization of American States, various European organizations of states, now Asian organizations. So they become part of the regional as well as the UN structure. They won a Peace Prize in 1977 for their campaign against torture. So you have then already in the early 60s the founding of a canonical organization which on the one hand wants to stay above politics, on the other hand it realizes it needs to engage in politics and debates this very actively and aggressively and gets people involved in this from all over the world. So every country now has an Amnesty International. So my point is then we have an interwar period, we have not much happening for the sort of 10 years after the Universal Declaration, and then we have a real outburst. So what happens in this modern era of the late 1960s and 1970s? And what I want to show you is that there's a great expansion of NGOs, activism, and attention. And why is this the case? Well, we've talked about some of the reasons. I think international standards are in place. Everyone in the world at least acknowledges that in principle, the Universal Declaration and these two ancillary ones on social and economic rights and on civic and political rights are normative. Yes? We may interpret the norms, but they're normative. Secondly, and this is important in the United States, and you'll see this in labor, the civil rights movement makes people aware of the fact that we are not above the violation, certainly above the violation of these issues. Thirdly, there is a turn, I think, to this international civil society because both in the West and in the East, understood to be a failure of 1968. It's a failure in the East of Europe because the pro-freedom demonstrations are squashed by Soviet arms. And they rightly, in my view, understood that if the Eastern Bloc was to collapse, it would have to collapse through some sort of moral or some sense that the Soviet would not use force rather than just through taking power. So when we talk next week with John Connolly, you'll see one of the powers of perestroika and this would finally produce the fall of this wall, which everyone thought was there forever, this division, was a kind of loss of faith by this leadership in its regime. So the turn to international civil society of a sort that we'll be talking about on one side. And on the other side, the failure of 1968, the student demonstrations, the general strike in France, and so forth, this idea that you were going to bring about a different, vaguely socialistic world through some kind of revolution. It wasn't going to happen. Didn't happen. And so I think in both sides, there was a turn to politics by different means. Some would say to no politics, but I would say to politics by different means. So it's clear that Physicians Without Borders grows out of a sense of the failure of the politics of the West. And Charter 77 and these various dissident groups in the East grow out of the failure of a kind of direct confrontation with the Soviet Union in the East. Well, then there are sort of other infrastructural changes that I want to at least point out to you. I think it's hard for you, living in the internet and Google age, to understand that there was once not as much information available at the click of a mouse or whatever you use. So that's a hugely important development. Now, we already know there was a big expansion of information in the 18th and the 19th century by their standards. We opened the course by talking about this humanitarian narrative and these pictures of slave ships, and I showed you how it was printed in all these different places. That increases logarithmically. Between 1965 and 1980, just the sheer quantity of information available on human rights around the world just grew dramatically. You see a little bit of this in labor, fact-finding missions, academic studies, congressional hearings, parliamentary hearings all over the world. One librarian sort of complained in the early 70s that it wasn't so much an explosion, it wasn't an explosive growth, it was actually an explosion of these documents which they couldn't keep track of. And there's also sort of a globalization of information. So we have an International Index of Censorship beginning in 1872. We have regional ones. The Israeli Handbook on Human Rights is produced in 1971. The Human Rights Bulletin, all these are in the 70s. The checklist of human rights documents, Human Rights Internet newsletter by the late 70s. The American Bar Association puts out one. So every country starts producing huge amounts of information which becomes internationally available. So everyone in the world now knows almost instantly what the status is of human rights almost everywhere in the world. Plus, best-selling novels like Solzhenitsyn on the gulags